You wake in a wooden hut. The wind howls through cracks in the walls. Food is nearly gone. Firewood's low. Outside, it's a killing cold, -20. Your fingers are numb. Your children are crying. There's no medicine, no central heating, no grocery store. This is winter in the 14th century. And unless you're rich, young, and lucky, you probably won't live to see the spring. By the time October's final harvest was gathered, every medieval household knew the clock had started ticking. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't a backdrop, was a looming threat. There was no guarantee that what you had would be enough. No fallback, no relief. Every family, from tenant farmers to lords of manors, braced for months of scarcity, sickness, and isolation. In much of Europe, the agricultural calendar revolved around two seasons, growing and enduring. Spring and summer were short bursts of activity, ploughing, sowing, harvesting. By late autumn, everything stopped. The land froze. Crops ceased. Days shortened, and so did the margin for error. If the harvest had been poor, or if grain stores were improperly dried or contaminated, the consequences would be felt by December. For peasants, there was no such thing as winter leisure. Life shifted from field to hearth, but survival remained labor-intensive. Firewood had to be collected and split before the snows blocked access to forests. Livestock needed shelter and feed, which meant hay had to be gathered and stored well in advance. Water, once easy to draw from rivers or wells, now had to be chipped from ice and boiled to make it safe. Daily life turned into endurance. The structure of rural society magnified the hardship. Most people lived in one room, wooden or wattle-and orb homes with no insulation. Heating came from a single hearth, with smoke often venting directly into the room. There was little privacy and no escape from cold drafts or rising damp. Poor families might share sleeping spaces with animals to conserve body heat, not out of ignorance but necessity. The fear of winter was malnutrition and disease thrived in closed quarters. With fresh food scarce, diets narrowed to stored grains, dried peas, and salted meats if those were available at all. Vitamin deficiencies weakened immune systems. In these conditions, a common cold could turn fatal. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and outbreaks of ergotism caused by moldy rye claimed thousands. In bad years, entire communities saw their numbers halved before the thaw. Even the wealthier strata weren't immune. While manor houses had stone walls and larger fireplaces, they were still drafty and difficult to heat. Nobles had the benefit of imported goods and preserved delicacies. But the social order meant they also had more mouths to feed. Household retainers, guards, clergy. Famine struck all classes, albeit unequally. Winter also paralyzed the economy. Roads became impassable. Markets slowed. Barter and trade collapsed under the weight of snow and mud. Travel was dangerous. Theft and poaching rose as desperation spread. Medieval chronicles didn't romanticize the season. They recorded it as a time of judgment, nature's reckoning. On the year's labor, planning, and fortune, a long winter could undo an entire year of work. A bad one could erase generations. This wasn't simply a harsh climate. It was a system of survival constantly on the brink. Winter, for the medieval world, was a slow siege. Most were poorly fortified. By November, the countryside fell silent. Fields once filled with laborers stood bare. The year's final harvest was in hand. Whatever had been gathered would have to last. There would be no more growing, no second chances. For medieval communities, this marked the beginning of the hunger season. Without refrigeration, preservation was a matter of urgency and limited options. Grain was the foundation of survival. Rye, barley, and oats were threshed and stored in granaries or large wooden bins, often sealed with clay or ash to keep pests out. But even with care, rodents, mold, and damp could ruin entire stores. A single mistake wet grain, a collapsed roof, or infestation could condemn a household to starvation by January. Vegetables like onions, turnips, and leeks were kept in root cellars or earthen pits, but they didn't last forever. Apples and cabbages spoiled without cold storage. Beans and peas were dried. If salt was available, meat from pigs or cattle slaughtered in late autumn could be preserved. But salt was expensive and not always accessible to the lower classes. Most peasants couldn't afford to preserve more than a few days' meat if they had any to begin with. The average peasant diet in winter was reduced to pottage, a thin stew made from grain, legumes, and scraps. Bread, often coarse and dark, filled stomachs but provided little nutrition. When grain ran low, people turned to substitute acorns, ground-up bark, or even clay. These were last resorts, not traditional dishes. The consequences of a poor harvest weren't limited to individual households. Medieval Europe had no formal famine relief system. If one village failed, there was rarely enough surplus elsewhere to assist, and transport in winter was nearly impossible. Roads became impassable, and merchants stopped traveling. Famine spread rapidly and unevenly, hitting isolated communities hardest. Historical records are filled with evidence of hunger. In 1315, heavy rains led to the Great Famine across much of Europe. Crops failed. Grain prices tripled. By the spring of 1316, people in England, France, and the Low Countries were eating cats, dogs, and even reportedly committing cannibalism. Chroniclers like John of Trocolo and the monks of St. Albans left behind grim accounts of entire families perishing, fields lying fallow, and dead bodies left unburied. Food scarcity didn't just kill, it weakened. Malnutrition, especially among children and the elderly, made communities more vulnerable to disease. The Black Death, decades later, found its victims already physically diminished from years of recurring hunger. Nobles and clergy, with access to manorial stores and trade connections, fared better. But even castle larders weren't limitless. Large households consumed food at a faster rate, and while preserved venison or imported spices made meals richer, they couldn't offset systemic shortages. Winter hunger was universal, it only varied in severity. When the harvest ended, a countdown began. Every bowl of porridge, every missing loaf, was part of a slow, quiet reckoning. And in the medieval world, survival wasn't just about what was stored, but what hadn't already rotted, spoiled, or been stolen before the first thaw. In the depths of a medieval winter, heat meant survival, but it came at a cost. Across Europe, the primary source of warmth in homes, whether peasant cottages or noble halls, was the open hearth. A simple fire pit at the center of a room, without a chimney, surrounded by stone or clay. Smoke from burning wood filled the air, rising through a hole in the roof or simply lingering in the rafters in rural homes. Especially among the peasantry, there was rarely any separation between the fire and daily life. Families cooked, ate, and slept in the same room. Smoke stung the eyes and coated walls in soot. Long-term exposure led to respiratory illnesses, chronic bronchitis, coughing, and shortness of breath. Children and the elderly suffered the worst. A warm fire might stave off frostbite, but it also slowly damaged the lungs. Fire was also a constant threat. Thatched roofs, dry timbers, and tightly packed furnishings turned houses into tinderboxes. A stray ember, a gust of wind, or a collapsed log could ignite the structure within minutes. There was no organized fire service. When a home burned, the neighbors might form a bucket line, but water had to be drawn by hand, often frozen solid. In towns, fire could jump from roof to roof, destroying entire streets. London's records show recurring fire ordinances from the 12th century onward, banning thatch in some areas and ordering curfews for extinguishing flames at night. Chimneys began appearing more widely only in the late medieval period, and mostly in wealthier households. Earlier versions, simple stone funnels, were inefficient and expensive. Most people made do with smoke hoods or left the fire open, letting the heat rise and vanish with the smoke. Fuel was another daily battle. Gathering wood wasn't just a chore, it was a survival strategy. Families sent children into the forest to scavenge kindling. Adults chopped logs from common lands or, when times were desperate, poached from private estates, an offence punishable by fine or imprisonment. In 1235, England's forest law classified even the collection of fallen branches as a criminal act if done without permission. Supply wasn't the only problem. Wet or green would produce little heat and much smoke. Charcoal burned cleaner, but was labor-intensive to produce and costly to buy. Peat, used in regions like Ireland and parts of Scotland, required months of drying. Dung, used when no wood was available, barely warmed a room at all. Even in manor houses and castles, fire was no guarantee of comfort. Though great halls often featured large fireplaces, most rooms were left unheated. Nobles wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks and furs, huddled around braziers, and relied on tapestries to block drafts. Stone walls absorbed the cold. Servants slept near the kitchens, not out of convenience but for the heat. There were no thermostats, no safety barriers, no second chances. In winter, a fire could mean the difference between life and death, but it could just as easily bring suffocation or burn everything to the ground. Winter in the medieval world didn't just bring hunger and cold, it brought disease. As temperatures dropped and people crowded indoors to conserve warmth, cottages turned into incubators for illness. Ventilation was poor, moisture built up in the walls, smoke lingered in the air. In these damp, dark conditions, even a minor cough could become a death sentence. The most common afflictions were respiratory. Influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis spread rapidly through close contact. Children and the elderly, already weakened by malnutrition, were especially vulnerable. A cold could escalate into bronchitis. A mild fever could spiral into lung infection. There were no antibiotics, no sterilized tools, no germ theory. Illness was often seen as divine punishment or an imbalance of bodily humors. Medical knowledge remained limited and largely based on ancient texts. The works of Galen and Hippocrates, copied and reinterpreted through Islamic scholars, shaped the way illness was understood. Physicians believed the body's health depended on balancing for humor's blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Winter was associated with excess phlegm, leading to treatments like bloodletting or purging. These remedies, often painful and unsanitary, weakened patients further. In the countryside, most people didn't see trained physicians. They relied on local healers, herbal remedies, and religious interventions. A fever might be treated with willow bark tea or garlic compresses. More serious conditions led families to seek help from monasteries. Monks kept herb gardens and preserved some medical texts, but even within abbey walls, care was limited. Disease ran its course more often than it was cured. Overcrowding made matters worse. The average peasant home housed a family of 5 to 10 people, sometimes more, all sleeping in a single room. In towns, winter meant a retreat indoors into inns, workshops, and shared tenements, combined with weakened immunity due to poor winter diets. Illness found an easy path from one body to the next. Urban centers fared no better. In places like London or Paris, the buildup of waste, stagnant water, and open cesspits created ideal conditions for disease. Even the wealthy, insulated by stone walls and private chambers, weren't immune. In January of 1362, chroniclers in England noted a mysterious pestilence of the lungs that killed thousands, likely an early outbreak of influenza or pneumonic plague. Physicians of the time had no answers, only prayers and vague warnings. The psychological toll was just as heavy. Illness during the cold months often meant isolation. Families shunned the sick for fear of contagion. Entire households were marked as cursed. In extreme winters, some communities buried the dead in mass graves before the ground froze solid. Survivors were left with not only grief, but fear of what the next season would bring. The cold didn't just chill the body, it stalled the immune system, slowed recovery, and created the perfect storm for infection to take hold. Without understanding its causes, medieval people endured wave after wave of sickness in silence, hoping each year that spring would come before the sickness. In winter, the class divide wasn't just visible, it was life-threatening. The medieval world was built on rigid hierarchies, and those differences became sharper when the temperature dropped. Survival came down to resources, and resources were distributed unequally by design. For the rural poor, shelter offered little more than temporary relief. Most peasants lived in single-room timber or wattle-and-daub cottages with thatched roofs and earthen floors. Insulation was non-existent. Gaps in the walls let in wind. The hearth, often open and smoky, provided limited warmth. Families slept close together, sometimes with livestock, in a bid to retain body heat. Blankets were scarce. Clothing, passed down and patched, consisted of coarse wool and linen, rarely enough to keep out frost. Food supplies followed the same pattern. A good harvest meant stored grains and preserved root vegetables. A bad harvest meant rationing before the solstice arrived. When supplies ran out, the poor had nowhere to turn. Monasteries offered some charity, but not enough. Malnutrition was common. Starvation wasn't rare. And in winter, weakened bodies meant higher chances of infection and death. Townsfolk lived under slightly different conditions. Artisans, traders, and laborers could sometimes afford better clothing or thicker walls. But heating still relied on wood or charcoal. In densely packed towns like York or Ghent, fuel prices rose in winter, and poorer households had to choose between warmth and food. Public sanitation was limited, and cramped quarters allowed disease to spread quickly. At the opposite end stood the nobility. Behind the stone walls of castles and manor houses, conditions were far from luxurious by modern standards, but far safer by medieval ones. Fireplaces with chimneys reduced smoke buildup. Multiple rooms meant better separation of the sick. Tapestries lined the walls. Straw or rushes were replaced more regularly. Fur-lined cloaks, woolen hose, and imported silks offered layers of warmth. Meals included dried fruits, spiced wine, and preserved game. Salted meat, stored in barrels, lasted through. The season. Medical care, too, was a reflection of status. While no class was immune to the limits of medieval medicine, nobles could summon physicians trained in universities, often in Paris, Salerno, or Montpellier. Treatments still revolved around humoral theory, but access to herbs, salves, and surgeries was better. The poor, by contrast, relied on folk remedies and oral tradition. Even justice reflected the imbalance. Poaching wood from a lord's forest to heat a cottage could result in fines, mutilation, or imprisonment. Royal forest laws, particularly in Norman England, criminalized the gathering of firewood without permission, further tightening control over the basic means of survival. The cold didn't discriminate, but society did. A noble's child might fall ill and recover beside a fire. A peasant's child might die in silence beneath a leaky roof. Wealth didn't guarantee safety, but it bought chances, comfort, options. And in the brutal winters of the medieval world, that often meant the difference between life and death. By December, movement across much of medieval Europe began to slow. Roads, already poor in fair weather, became treacherous or impassable. Snow drifted high across paths. Rivers froze. Thick mud swallowed cartwheels. What little infrastructure existed, stone bridges, dirt tracks, shallow fords, was not built to endure the full weight of winter. Villages, once loosely connected by trade and communication, were now cut off. Merchants ceased travel. Markets in towns fell quiet. Caravans stopped moving. Supply chains, already limited in range and efficiency, completely. If a local harvest failed, there was no way to bring in grain from another region. Food shortages worsened. Isolation became lethal in more remote settlements, particularly in the mountainous regions of the Alps, the Scottish Highlands, or northern Scandinavia. This isolation could last months. Travel was dangerous, slow, and often fatal. Families who faced starvation had few choices. Letters and messengers rarely got through. For most, the horizon narrowed to the edge of the village or the edge of the forest. Beyond that, nothing could be relied on. Monasteries and manorial estates tried to maintain lines of communication, especially where tithes or rents were involved. But even they could not defy the weather. In 1316, during the second year of the Great Famine, reports from rural France and Germany described entire hamlets vanishing, no word sent, no survivors traveling out. Local officials arrived in spring to find homes abandoned or filled with the dead. The breakdown of movement also froze justice and governance. Royal courts didn't travel. Local reeves and bailiffs postponed duties. Taxes, if not collected before the freeze, had to wait. Law enforcement was limited, and banditry increased near mountain passes and forest trails. The isolation gave cover to theft, and sometimes to rebellion. Pilgrimages, once a spiritual escape, halted. Traders who had once carried not only goods, but news rumors of wars, royal decrees, religious changes from the roads. With them went any sense of a wider world. In the silence of winter, the outside world receded. For many, what happened beyond the village was unknown until the thaw, and when catastrophe struck, a barn collapse, a house fire, A spreading illness there was nowhere to run. No nearby physician. No neighboring village that could be reached. In time, people died where they were, quietly forgotten until spring. This was the other edge of winter. Not just the cold, or the hunger, or the disease, but the total stillness that came when roads disappeared and no help could come. Survival meant isolation, and isolation, for many, meant being left to face the season alone. Medieval winter clothing was practical, but far from comfortable. Modern depictions often show villagers bundled in thick cloaks beside roaring fires, but the reality was colder, wetter, and far more dangerous. There was no thermal insulation, no waterproof lining, and no standard protection against frostbite. The primary fabric of the medieval wardrobe was wool. It was abundant, durable, and relatively warm, especially when woven thick and worn in layers. But wool alone wasn't enough. Beneath it, people wore undertunics of linen softer on the skin, but offering little insulation. The poorest might own only 1 or 2 garments, patched and handed down for years. These clothes absorbed moisture quickly and dried slowly. Once wet, they clung to the skin and chilled the body. Outerwear included mantles or cloaks, fastened at the shoulder with a brooch. Fur was used, but rarely among the lower classes. Squirrels, rabbits, and even dog pelts were repurposed into linings when available, though the finest furzeman, fox, and sable were reserved for the nobility. A 1330 English statute attempted to restrict the wearing of certain furs to knights and lords, illustrating how deeply clothing reflected status. Footwear was another weak point. Leather boots, when available, were stiff and porous. Greased or oiled leather offered some resistance to snow, but not much. Most commoners wore ankle-height turnshoes, soft leather soles stitched to uppers. These provided minimal protection from cold or moisture. In freezing weather, feet went numb, cracked, and in severe cases, turned black. Frostbite, though unnamed, was well known. Headwear included coifs, hoods, and woolen caps. These were critical. Loss from the head was understood, even if the science behind it wasn't. But for many, warmth came not from the fabric itself, but from the body heat trapped between layers. People learned to conserve warmth through proximity-crowded beds, shared cloaks, and huddling near fires. The nobility had better options. Tailors in cities like Bruges, Paris, and London crafted fitted garments lined with fur and reinforced with padding. Knights wore quilted gambesons under armor that doubled as insulation. Wealth afforded variety layers could be changed, aired, and kept dry. Servants maintained wardrobes, repaired seams, and stoked fires throughout the day. Even so, stone castles were not warm. Tapestries blocked drafts, but rooms beyond the great hall remained cold. Contrary to romanticized portrayals, medieval fashion was not designed for warmth. It was shaped by economy, access, and necessity. The poor layered what they could. The rich layered what they wanted. But no one was fully protected. Hypothermia wasn't understood by name, but its effects were everywhere: shivering bodies, blackened extremities, and lifeless figures discovered in the snow. Clothing was never the solution. It was only part of the fight. And every winter, that fight began again against a cold that cloth alone could not keep out. Work in the medieval winter didn't pause. It shifted. Fields lay dormant under frost, but survival required effort. From dawn to dusk, every task was harder in the cold. Every minute exposed to wind or snow carried risk. And yet, there was no alternative. Winter didn't excuse labor, it demanded more of it. Livestock came first. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens were essential to survival, yet vulnerable to the cold. In small villages across England and the continent, animals were often housed under the same roof as their owners, separated only by a wooden partition or stone wall. This kept them from freezing and provided some warmth to the household. But it also brought smell, noise, and disease. Manure had to be shoveled daily, frozen water troughs cracked open with tools, and feed distributed by hand, often carried in sacks over icy ground. When animals fell sick, it threatened more than just meat. It meant the loss of milk, eggs, labor, and, by spring, reproduction. Water was another daily struggle. In summer, villagers drew from wells or streams. In winter, those sources froze. Ice had to be broken and carried home in buckets. Snow could be melted, but it took time, fuel, and effort. Wells became treacherous, with slick stones and the constant danger of falling in. Roofs leaked, thatched coverings soaked through or collapsed. Under the weight of snow, families patched holes with straw and mud, working with numb fingers. If the roof failed, everything inside was ruin grain, bedding, firewood. Repairs couldn't wait. Even children were expected to help, handing up tools or gathering thatch from frozen stacks. The need for firewood was relentless. A single household could burn through a cartload in a week. Gathering it meant chopping, splitting, stacking, and hauling in sleet or snow. Commoners had to scour forests for dead wood, or twigs. Cutting live trees without permission risked heavy punishment. In many parts of England, forest laws under monarchs like Henry II banned even the collection of fallen branches in royal lands. Yet people did it anyway. The risk of freezing outweighed the risk of being caught inside. Work continued. Women spun wool by the fire, patched clothing, and prepared meals with dwindling ingredients. Children ground grain by hand or fetched wood. Life revolved around constant motion. Any pause in labor invited the cold in. There were no weekends, no holidays from survival. Even feast days meant more preparation, more firewood, more livestock to tend. For most of the population, winter was not a time of rest. It was a season-long struggle to keep going, to repair, to carry, to feed, and to endure. One task at a time. The medieval winter tested more than the body, it tested the mind. In a world without certainty, where cold claimed the weak and hunger lingered for months, people turned to what they could not see. Faith and folklore filled the silence. Between hardship and hope, the church was the dominant force in shaping the spiritual calendar. Winter was punctuated by holy days. St. Martin's Day on November 11th marked the end of the agricultural season. Advent began soon after, a period of fasting and penitence that led into Christmas. But this was not the Christmas of modern memory. It was a solemn season, focused on liturgy and divine judgment. The Nativity was celebrated, but always under the shadow of sin, salvation, and suffering. Fasting, particularly during Advent and Lent, wasn't optional. It was a required spiritual discipline, enforced by both ecclesiastical authority and communal pressure. Meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden on many days. For the poor, already malnourished, the restriction blurred the line between devotion and starvation, yet religious observance offered structure. Saints' days created markers in the calendar, small rituals to break the monotony. Feasts of St. Nicholas, St. Lucy, and Epiphany brought brief relief. In monasteries, chants and prayers echoed through cold stone walls, reminding the faithful that endurance had meaning. In villages, church bells and mass became the rhythm of psychological survival. But Christianity wasn't the only force at play. Across Europe, older beliefs lingered just beneath the surface. Yule traditions in the Germanic and Scandinavian regions included symbols that predated Christendom evergreens as signs of life, bonfires to drive away darkness, and tales of spectral hunts led by ghostly figures. In Anglo-Saxon England, the 12 nights following the winter solstice were considered dangeressa, liminal time when the boundary between worlds thinned. Stories circulated of winter spirits, the alpine perchter who punished the lazy, the Scandinavian tomt, protectors of farms, or the wild hunt, an omen of death and misfortune. These weren't dismissed as myth. They were part of lived reality explanations for sudden illness, failed crops, or strange noises in the dark in some regions. Rituals were performed to ward off evil. Salt was sprinkled at thresholds. Charms were buried in fields. Bells were rung not only to call the faithful, but to frighten away what couldn't be named. These practices weren't escapism. They were systems of meaning in a world with few guarantees. They gave people something to hold on to when nothing else could be controlled. In the face of freezing nights, silent deaths, and vanishing stores, the mind sought patterns whether in scripture, legend, or superstition. Faith, folklore, and fear were woven together, not in contradiction, but in coexistence. And for many, belief was what carried them through the longest nights of the year. Central heating, electric lights, insulated boots, fresh food on demand. Today, winter is a season of inconvenience. In the medieval world, it was a test of endurance, and most modern people wouldn't last a week. A 21st century home, even in the coldest regions, can maintain a constant indoor temperature with the turn of a dial. In contrast, a peasant household in the 14th century relied on a single open hearth, often venting smoke directly into the room. There was no insulation, no glass windows. Blankets were limited, shared, and patched year after year. Nighttime temperatures inside could drop to freezing. You slept in the same clothes you wore during the day if you had more than one set to begin with. Modern winter wardrobes are layered with synthetic materials engineered for warmth. Waterproof boots, down jackets, thermal gloves, none of it existed. A medieval traveler might wrap themselves in wool and fur, but if their feet got wet, they stayed wet. Hypothermia was a slow, silent killer. So was frostbite. There were no warning systems, no emergency services, no weather forecasts. Food security is another luxury. Today, a grocery store can supply exotic produce from across the globe, year-round. In the Middle Ages, winter meals came from what was stored in autumn. If the harvest failed, or the storage went bad, hunger followed. Diets narrowed to gruel, dried legumes, and black bread. Salted meat was rare. Fruit and vegetables were almost non-existent. Vitamins ran low. Bodies weakened. Sickness spread. And when it did, there was no modern healthcare to fall back on. No antibiotics, no hospitals. At best, a local healer with dried herbs. At worst, no one at all. Water had to be fetched by hand, often chipped from frozen streams. Wood for fire had to be gathered, chopped, and carried every day. No power grid. No fuel delivery. Every comfort had to be earned through labor. Exhausting, repetitive, and dangerous. The elderly didn't retire. Children worked alongside adults. Fatigue wasn't an exception. It was the default state of winter socially. The support systems of today, government aid, charitable institutions, mass communication did not exist in any organized form. Isolation meant vulnerability. Entire villages disappeared in harsh winters, remembered only in tax records and monastery chronicles. Chroniclers like Adam of Usk or the monks of St. Albans documented years when famine and cold turned regions into ghost settlements. Medieval winter survival wasn't about fortitude. It was necessity, repetition, and luck. Modern conveniences create distance from this reality, but they don't erase it. Remove the thermostat, the supermarket, the padded coat, what remains is a world that demanded everything, every single day. And in that world, most people today wouldn't survive until Sunday.